saw the F9F Panther, the Navy's first jet fighter to see combat.
The morning sky over the Yalu River hung pale and cold, a canvas stretched taut between two worlds that had ceased speaking except through violence. It was November 1950, and American naval aviators climbing into the cramped cockpits of their Grumman F9F Panthers understood they were about to encounter something fundamentally different from anything their service had prepared them for. The Panthers themselves represented the bleeding edge of American naval aviation technology, sleek, straight-wing jets that had replaced the propeller-driven Corsairs and Bearcats only months before. Their Pratt and Whitney J-42 turbojet engines, licensed copies of the British Rolls-Royce Nini, could push the aircraft to speeds approaching 600 miles per hour, a velocity that would have seemed fantastical to the pilots who flew off carrier decks just 5 years earlier during the final campaigns against Japan. The F9F Panther was born from urgency and compromise. Grumman had begun the design as a four-engine night fighter in the war's closing months, but the rapid evolution of jet propulsion technology rendered that concept obsolete before the first prototype flew. The redesign embraced a single, powerful turbojet mounted in the fuselage, with straight wings chosen for their compatibility with carrier operations. Swept wings, though faster, demanded higher landing speeds that made deck approaches treacherous. The result was an aircraft that traded raw speed for reliability, one that could be landed on a pitching deck by mortals rather than only by test pilots with ice water in their veins. Its four 20mm cannons, mounted in the nose with 600 rounds of ammunition, could shred ground targets or tear through the aluminum skin of enemy aircraft. For hard points beneath the wings, it could carry bombs, rockets, or fuel tanks, making it versatile enough for the Navy's diverse mission requirements in this new kind of war. The pilots flying these machines over Korea had learned their trade in an interregnum, that strange pause between total war and cold confrontation when military budgets shrank and the services struggled to define their roles in a world suddenly divided by ideology rather than territorial ambition. Most had never fired their guns in anger. They had trained against each other, circling above Nevada deserts and Carolina coastal waters, mastering the new physics of jet combat, where energy management replaced the simple geometry of propeller-driven dogfighting. In their briefings, intelligence officers had spoken of possible encounters with Soviet-built aircraft, but the information remained vague, almost theoretical. The communist forces seemed to rely primarily on piston-engine fighters, remnants of the war just ended, aircraft the Panthers could outrun, if not always outmaneuver. That calculation shattered the moment the first MiG-15s appeared. The Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-15 emerged from a Soviet-designed philosophy that differed fundamentally from American approaches to aviation. Where the United States had built an industrial infrastructure capable of producing thousands of complex, sophisticated aircraft, the Soviet Union prioritized simplicity, mass production, and overwhelming performance in specific flight regimes. The MiG-15's genesis lay in captured German research, wind tunnel data on swept wings, design studies on high-speed aerodynamics, all the accumulated knowledge of Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf engineers who had pushed the boundaries of possibility in the war's desperate final years. Soviet designers absorbed these lessons and combined them with a British engine, the Rolls-Royce Nini, which the Labour government had inexplicably sold to Moscow in 1946, in what would later be recognized as one of the century's more consequential acts of technological transfer. The MiG-15 that resulted from this fusion of German aerodynamic science and British propulsion technology represented a revolution in fighter design. Its wings swept back at 35 degrees, reducing drag at high subsonic speeds and allowing the aircraft to approach the speed of sound in a dive. Its Klimov VK-1 engine, a Soviet-improved version of the Nene, generated considerably more thrust than the Panther's power plant. But the MiG's most shocking characteristic was its ceiling. It could operate comfortably above 50,000 feet, an altitude where the Panther's controls became mushy, and its engine gasped for oxygen. The Soviet designers had built an interceptor optimized for a single purpose: climbing rapidly to extreme altitudes and destroying American strategic bombers. That it also happened to outperform nearly every fighter the West could field was almost a secondary consideration. The first confirmed encounter between Panthers and MiGs occurred on November 9, 1950, when Lieutenant Commander William Aumann led a section of fighters from USS Philippines Sea on a strike against bridges near Sinuiju, right on the Korean-Chinese border. The mission brief had mentioned possible enemy air activity, but the phrasing suggested propeller-driven Yak-9s, or perhaps the occasional jet trainer. What Aumann and his wingmen encountered instead were swept-wing fighters diving out of the sun with a speed and aggression that spoke to both superior performance and pilot training far beyond what intelligence assessments had predicted. The first MiG flashed past Aumann's Panther so quickly he barely registered its presence before it pulled up into a climbing turn that no straight-winged fighter could hope to follow. The silvery aircraft seemed to hang in the sky for a moment, suspended by thrust and swept aerodynamics, before rolling over and diving back toward the American formation. Aumann pushed his throttle to the firewall and yanked his Panther into the tightest turn the airframe could sustain, feeling the G-forces crush him into his seat and narrow his vision to a tunnel. The MiG's cannons opened fire, 37mm and 23mm shells, designed to destroy bombers now being employed against fighters, and Aumann watched tracers arc past his canopy with a lazy grace that belied their lethality. The engagement that followed defied the clean geometries taught in tactical schools. The MiGs operated in pairs, one aircraft engaging while its wingmen positioned for a follow-up attack, a discipline that suggested extensive training against dissimilar aircraft types. They used their superior speed and climb rate to dictate engagement terms, diving through the American formation to disrupt it, then zooming back to altitude before the Panthers could bring their guns to bear. Aumann managed to get his nose on a MiG for perhaps 2 seconds, long enough to fire a burst that missed before the Soviet fighter simply accelerated away, pulling into a climb that left the Panther wallowing in its wake like a rowboat chasing a speedboat. The engagement broke off as suddenly as it began, the MiGs departing north across the Yalu when their fuel state or some other consideration dictated withdrawal. Aumann's section returned to Philippines Sea with aircraft intact, but illusions shattered. That evening, in the carrier's ready room, the pilots reconstructed the engagement while intelligence officers took notes and tried to square what they were hearing with what they thought they knew about Soviet capabilities. The conclusion was inescapable. The swept-wing fighters represented a generational leap in performance, and the Panther, for all its virtues, was fundamentally outclassed in air-to-air combat against this new opponent. The implications rippled through the Pacific Fleet with the speed of a shockwave. The Navy's jet fighter force had been built around the assumption of air superiority, or at minimum parity with any likely opponent. That assumption now lay in ruins. The MiG-15's performance envelope overlapped almost perfectly with the Panther's weaknesses. It climbed faster, flew higher, and accelerated more rapidly. In a prolonged turning fight, the lighter wing loading of the Panther gave it an advantage, but the MiGs never allowed such fights to develop. They struck from altitude, used their speed to evade retaliation, and climbed back to positions of advantage before the Americans could respond effectively. Yet the Panther pilots adapted, not through technological innovation, but through tactical refinement and an almost philosophical acceptance of their aircraft's limitations. If they couldn't outclimb the MiGs, they would stay low, operating in the thick air where the Panther's engine performed adequately, and the MiG's speed advantage diminished. If they couldn't catch a fleeing MiG in level flight, they would position their formations to deny the Soviets easy diving attacks, flying in mutually supporting pairs where one aircraft's vulnerability became another's opportunity. The doctrine evolved organically, passed from squadron to squadron through after-action reports and ready-room discussions. A collective learning process that transformed defeat into something approaching competitive disadvantage rather than certain destruction. The aircraft themselves revealed the different industrial philosophies that shaped the Cold War's technological competition. Opening a Panther's inspection panels revealed American manufacturing at its most sophisticated. Precisely machined components, redundant systems, careful attention to maintainability and reliability. Navy maintainers could perform engine changes aboard carriers in heavy seas, could patch battle damage with equipment available in the ship's workshops, could keep the Panthers flying through the constant abuse of carrier operations. The MiG-15, by contrast, represented ruthless optimization for performance over all other considerations. Soviet designers had eliminated everything unnecessary, reducing the aircraft to its essential components. This made it lighter and faster, but also less forgiving of damage and more demanding of maintenance infrastructure. The human element complicated the purely technological comparison. The MiG pilots operating over the Yalu during those early engagements were not, as American intelligence initially assumed, hastily trained Chinese or North Korean aviators. Many were Soviet Air Force veterans, experienced pilots flying from bases in Manchuria, under strict orders to maintain the fiction that they were Chinese volunteers. Their radios transmitted in Russian, their tactics reflected Soviet doctrine, and their aggression suggested men who understood both their aircraft's capabilities and their adversaries' limitations. They had trained extensively in the MiG-15, mastering its quirks, the tendency to snap roll at high angles of attack, the frozen controls at extreme altitude, the cannon's slow rate of fire that demanded precise aim rather than hosing fire. As winter deepened over Korea, the air war settled into a pattern of bitter attritional combat. Panther squadrons flew strike missions against bridges, supply lines, and troop concentrations, knowing that MiGs might dive out of the stratosphere at any moment. The engagements themselves rarely lasted more than minutes, the MiGs making a single pass, or perhaps two, before withdrawing across the Yalu to the sanctuary of Chinese airspace. American pilots learned to spot the telltale contrails at extreme altitude, learned to time their evasive brakes to make the MiG's firing solutions impossible, learned to accept that survival, rather than victory, was often the best available outcome. The casualty statistics told a story of adaptation under pressure. Initial encounters saw Panthers damaged or destroyed with alarming frequency, the MiG's heavy cannons capable of catastrophic damage from a single hit. But as American pilots internalized the new tactical realities, loss rates declined, even as sortie counts increased. The Panther would never be a MiG killer in the way the Air Force's F-86 Sabres proved to be, but it could survive in contested airspace long enough to accomplish its primary mission of ground attack, and occasionally, when circumstances aligned perfectly, a Panther pilot might catch a careless MiG in a vulnerable position and score a kill. Lieutenant Royce Williams achieved one such victory on November 18, 1952, in an engagement that demonstrated both the Panther's limitations and the possibilities inherent in pilot skill and tactical positioning. Williams was flying combat air patrol over the carrier task force when his section encountered 7 MiG-15s, an overwhelming numerical disadvantage compounded by the performance differential. The engagement lasted 35 minutes, an eternity in jet combat, as Williams used every trick he had learned to survive. He kept his speed up, making shallow dives to trade altitude for velocity when MiGs positioned for firing runs. He used the Panther's superior low-altitude maneuverability to force overshoots, momentarily reversing the attacker-defender dynamic. He fired only when certain of a hit, conserving ammunition for the moments when a MiG pilot's mistake brought an aircraft into his gun sight. By the engagement's end, Williams had shot down 4 MiGs and damaged 2 others, while his Panther absorbed multiple cannon strikes that left the aircraft barely flyable. The feat was so extraordinary that it remained classified for decades, the Navy reluctant to publicize an engagement that revealed how often American carrier groups operated within range of Soviet fighters. Williams's victory demonstrated that the Panther could compete under perfect circumstances with perfect execution, But it also underscored how rarely such circumstances arose and how much they demanded of the pilot. The technological gap between Panther and MiG-15 reflected broader asymmetries in how the superpowers approached military aviation. American design philosophy emphasized versatility. The Panther needed to excel at ground attack, perform adequately in air combat, survive carrier operations, and remain maintainable with shipboard resources. Soviet designers faced no such constraints. The MiG-15 operated from prepared airfields with extensive ground support infrastructure. It needed to excel at one mission, intercepting bombers, and merely be adequate at everything else. This specialization allowed performance optimization that simply wasn't possible with multi-role carrier aircraft. The engines illustrated this divergence perfectly. The Panther's Pratt and Whitney J-42 was reliable, relatively fuel-efficient, and maintainable, characteristics essential for carrier operations, where engine failures could mean an aircraft ditching in cold seas far from rescue. The MiG-15's Klimov VK-1 prioritized raw power, accepting higher fuel consumption and shorter time between overhauls in exchange for thrust that could push the aircraft to altitudes and speeds American fighters couldn't match. Neither approach was inherently superior. They reflected different operational requirements and industrial capabilities, different answers to the fundamental question of what a fighter aircraft should accomplish. The armament choices revealed similar divergences. The Panther's 4 20mm cannons represented a compromise between weight, ammunition capacity, and destructive effect against various targets. They could strafe ground positions, destroy light vehicles, damage hardened targets with armor-piercing rounds, and shoot down aircraft with reasonable effectiveness. The MiG-15's combination of 137mm and 223mm cannons was optimized for destroying heavy bombers with minimum exposure time. A single hit from the 37mm cannon could sever a bomber's wing or detonate its fuel tanks. Against fighters, this armament was excessive and unwieldy, the slow rate of fire and heavy recoil making precise marksmanship difficult. But the Soviets had designed the MiG to kill B-29s and B-50s, not to dogfight with carrier aircraft over Korea. The aerial battles over the Yalu River existed within a larger strategic context that constrained both sides. American forces operated under strict rules of engagement that forbade pursuit across the Chinese border, creating a sanctuary where MiGs could operate with impunity before and after engagements. Soviet pilots flew under equally rigid constraints. They were forbidden from operating over water, where capture might reveal their presence, forbidden from speaking Russian on radio frequencies Americans might monitor, forbidden from pressing attacks that might lead to crashes in South Korean territory, where wreckage could be examined. The air war thus became a strange limited conflict, lethal but contained, where both sides tested equipment and tactics while carefully avoiding escalation that might transform a regional conflict into global catastrophe. The Panthers continued flying strike missions throughout the war, absorbing losses, evolving tactics, accomplishing the unglamorous work that constitutes most military aviation, destroying bridges that enemy engineers would rebuild, strafing supply columns that would be replaced, supporting ground forces locked in positional warfare that produced casualties without territorial change. The MiG-15s continued diving from the stratosphere, enforcing Soviet air superiority over the northwestern approaches to North Korea, occasionally shooting down a Panther or a bomber, more often simply disrupting American strike packages and forcing pilots to jettison bombs before reaching their targets. The war ended in July 1953, with an armistice that resolved nothing, merely freezing the conflict along roughly the same line where it had begun 3 years earlier. The Panther squadrons returned to their carriers, the MiG regiments withdrew to bases in the Soviet Far East, and both sides began analyzing the lessons learned. For the Americans, Korea had demonstrated that technological superiority could not be assumed, that industrial might did not automatically translate into battlefield dominance, and that carrier-based aviation faced fundamental limitations against land-based opponents operating from prepared positions. The Panther had proven reliable but inadequate, a transitional design overtaken by events before it could mature. For the Soviets, the MiG-15's performance validated their design philosophy and revealed vulnerabilities in American air defenses that would shape military planning for decades. They had built an interceptor capable of destroying the strategic bombers on which American nuclear strategy depended, and they had tested it in combat against pilots who represented the same service that would operate those bombers in any future conflict. The lessons learned over Korea directly influenced the next generation of Soviet fighters, aircraft like the MiG-17 and MiG-19 that refined the MiG-15's basic concept while addressing its limitations. The technology itself evolved with relentless speed, rendering both Panther and early model MiG-15 obsolescent within years of Korea's end. The Navy's next carrier fighter, the F9F Cougar, was essentially a swept-wing Panther, an evolutionary rather than revolutionary improvement that acknowledged American industry's struggles to match Soviet performance. Not until the F-8 Crusader and F-4 Phantom would American carrier aviation field fighters capable of competing on equal terms with the latest Soviet designs. And by then, the competition had shifted to guided missiles and radar systems, rendering the gun-based dogfighting of Korea as anachronistic as cavalry charges. Yet, those engagements between Panthers and MiGs over the Yalu represented something more than mere technological competition. They were the first sustained air combat between jet aircraft, the first time pilots engaged at speeds and altitudes that would have been impossible 5 years earlier. Every engagement generated data, refined understanding, exposed assumptions. Pilots learned that jet combat was fundamentally different from propeller-driven fighting, that energy management mattered more than instantaneous turn rates, that altitude conferred advantages that couldn't be overcome through pilot skill alone. These lessons, purchased in blood and fire above frozen Korean valleys, shaped how air forces thought about combat, trained their pilots, and designed their next-generation fighters. The human cost of this education defies easy quantification. Panther pilots who died in burning cockpits above the Yalu left behind families, communities, unrealized potential. MiG pilots who failed to return to their Manchurian bases vanished into bureaucratic silence, their sacrifices unacknowledged for decades, while the Soviet Union maintained the fiction of non-involvement. The ground crews who launched and recovered aircraft from carrier decks, who patched battle damage and coaxed maximum performance from worn engines, who worked 18-hour days in howling wind and salt spray. Their contribution rarely appears in official histories, but made everything else possible. The Panthers themselves ended their service lives in various ways. Some remained in naval service as trainers, their combat days finished, but their utility as pilot training platforms extending into the late 1950s. Others went to reserve squadrons, then to boneyards in Arizona desert, where they sat in neat rows awaiting scrapping. A handful survived as museum pieces, static displays representing a brief moment when straight-wing jets seemed like the future before swept-wing designs revealed they were already the past. The MiG-15s had longer service lives, their superior performance keeping them relevant in air forces worldwide through the 1960s and beyond. Some flew for Soviet client states in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, becoming the archetypal adversary aircraft against which Western fighters measured themselves. The technical specifications of both aircraft tell part of the story. Thrust-to-weight ratios, wing loadings, service ceilings, maximum speeds. But these numbers obscure what mattered most. The human beings who strapped these machines to their backs and climbed into hostile skies where death arrived faster than thought. The Panther pilot who saw MiG contrails at 40,000 feet and knew those aircraft could be overhead in seconds. The MiG pilot rolling inverted at the top of a climb, selecting a target from the American formation below, calculating deflection angles while pulling G-forces that grade vision. These moments of extreme concentration and mortal danger constituted the war's reality, not the sanitized after-action reports or the statistical summaries. The engagements produced heroes, though the term fits uneasily with the random distribution of survival and death in air combat. Some pilots accumulated kills through a combination of skill, aggression, and fortune. Others flew flawlessly, but never encountered situations where their abilities could produce dramatic results. The finest pilot in the world could be shot down by a second-rate adversary who happened to be in the right position at the right moment, while mediocre pilots survived through sheer luck. This randomness troubled military organizations that wanted to believe competence ensured survival, that training and discipline provided some protection against chaos. The broader strategic significance of these air battles remains contested among historians. Some argue they demonstrated the futility of limited war, the impossibility of achieving decisive results when political constraints prevented military commanders from exploiting tactical advantages. Others see them as a successful containment, proof that superpowers could fight proxy conflicts without triggering nuclear escalation. The Panther versus MiG engagements support both interpretations. They showed American technological vulnerability, while also demonstrating adaptability and resilience under pressure. The industrial dimension deserves emphasis. Building jet fighters in quantity demanded manufacturing capabilities that few nations possessed. The tolerances required for turbine blades, the metallurgy necessary for airframes capable of withstanding supersonic speeds, the electronics for fire control systems, each component represented significant technological challenges. The United States and Soviet Union could field these aircraft in hundreds, then thousands, while other nations struggled to build even prototypes. This disparity shaped global power relations in ways that persist today, establishing aerospace manufacturing as a marker of great power status. The pilots themselves became ambassadors of sorts, their experiences shaping how military services understood jet combat. Squadron ready rooms became classrooms where tactical innovations spread through informal networks, where the pilot who survived a particular MiG tactic explained his counter-response to colleagues who might face the same situation next week. This decentralized learning process proved remarkably effective, generating doctrinal evolution that formal command structures might have taken years to develop and disseminate. Looking back across 7 decades, the Panther MiG engagements appear as a threshold, a moment when warfare crossed definitively into the jet age and all its implications. The Korean War as a whole occupies an awkward position in American memory, overshadowed by World War II's clear moral stakes and Vietnam's traumatic divisions. But for understanding how technology shapes conflict, how industrial capabilities translate into battlefield outcomes, and how tactical adaptation can partially compensate for technical inferiority, those aerial battles over frozen Korean valleys offer essential lessons. The aircraft themselves were tools, neither good nor evil, their characteristics determined by the engineering choices their designers made within specific constraints. The Panther's straight wings and robust construction reflected one set of priorities. The MiG-15's swept aerodynamics and optimized performance reflected another. Neither was objectively superior in all circumstances. Each excelled in certain flight regimes and struggled in others. What mattered ultimately was how human beings employed these tools, what they accomplished with imperfect equipment against determined opposition. The legacy lives on in unexpected ways. Modern carrier fighters trace design lineage through evolutionary branches that include the Panther, incorporating lessons learned when pilots discovered their straight wings couldn't match swept wing performance. The MiG-15's influence appears in countless interceptor designs worldwide, its basic configuration proving sound enough to spawn variants and derivatives that serve for decades. The tactical doctrines developed during those desperate minutes Over the Yalu informed air combat training programs that continue today, teaching pilots that technology alone never guarantees victory, that tactics and situational awareness matter as much as airframe performance.